I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University and a visiting professor at the Catholique University of Leuven, and I welcome you to this course presented by Professor Andrea Robilio at the Catholique University of Leuven and myself on Thomas Aquinas on the nature and attainment of happiness. This course is taking place in fall 2012. This is class number 12, focused on Aquinas on ultimate happiness in the Summa theologiae, prima secundae, questions 1 through 3. And this is video 12, considering ultimate human happiness in the context of theology. Or at least that's the way I'd like us to think about it in this context. So this will be the only video. It'll be a little bit longer than usual, but it'll be the only video that we have for this particular class, for class number 12. But let me proceed. So class 12 is focused on the Summa theologiae, prima secundae, questions 1 through 3, in which Aquinas takes up issues of the ultimate end of human beings as ultimate happiness in a theological context. There's no question, this is in a theological context. In his article, among the required reading for the class, Wieland emphasizes the contextual differences between, 1, the Summa contra Gentiles, where the foundations for discussion in Book 3 of that work were philosophical determinations and proofs found in the earlier books of that work, and 2, the approach of the Summa theologiae, which is essentially and professedly a book of theology. But I want to raise some questions on this. That is this really as profoundly true a difference between the two works as Wieland seems to assert it to be? I propose that as we proceed with this, we watch out for precisely this. That is, we consider very carefully whether the reasoning of Aquinas is philosophical or theological. I think it'll be very valuable for us to keep that critical consideration in mind. Continuing this overview then, after considering the question above, we will go on to consider teachings in questions 1 through 3. But this consideration will not be in quite the order of the texts. Now, by that last remark, I mean to indicate that rather than considering the texts in the order in which they appear for each question, I want to begin with consideration of the last article, since that will display for us the goal toward which Aquinas reasons for each question. Perhaps it is not always true that the final article in any question in the works of Aquinas is the culminating point toward which prior articles are pointing. I'm certainly not making that claim here. Still, in this case, I think we can profit from considering each question first from the consideration of the final article, and then considering how each of the prior articles in the question contribute to the reasoning in the concluding article. There is some merit as well from considering in a general way how questions 1 and 2 contribute to the goals of question 3. By that I mean that we should appreciate that question 3 deals with just what happiness is for human beings as intellectual beings. This focuses on the object to be attained in happiness, which is the essence of God, noetically apprehended in the visions of God's essence. There, God himself is the end to be attained. Question 1 was more about consideration of the nature of human beings and the end for which human beings, though in its last article it established that God is not just the end for human beings. Question 2 again considers human beings and the various ends that are open to humans with a view to establishing whether happiness is found intrinsic to human operations or must be found in something extrinsic to the human being. With this perspective on the order of the questions in mind, then, let's proceed to question 1. This question consists of 8 articles, concluding with an article on, quote, whether all creatures concur with man in the last end, close quote. Now, in question 1, article 8, Aquinas reaches the more universal conclusion that God is not only the end of human beings, but the end of all created reality. Hence, the case for human beings is just an instance of how all creatures have God as their end toward which they tend, in ways varying with their natures. Of course, intellectual beings in this differ radically from non-intellectual created entities, since what has intellect also has will for Aquinas. So, with what is to be established in question 1, Article 8 in mind, let's then return to question 1, Article 1. In question 1, Article 1, in the response, Aquinas makes the important distinction between the acts of human beings and distinctively human acts. The latter concerns those acts which are specifically those of a human being employing reason and will, that is, employing deliberation and free will, liberum arbitrium. And here Aquinas defines free will as, quote, the faculty and will of reason, close quote. As always, as philosophers, we're on the watch for definitions. Human actions are those in which reason and will are used, while actions of humans, such as scratching a beard, an example Aquinas uses elsewhere following Avicenna's discussion of human teleology, may be actions done by human beings, but perhaps do not have a distinctively rational part to them. As he puts it, quote, they are not proper to man as man. Aquinas' purpose here, then, is to establish that reason and will in relation to some end, as a desired good, indicate that human beings act for an end in the fullest sense, when they deliberate by means of reason and decide voluntarily by means of will in regard to what is good, and in regard to what actions to be taken. So let's proceed to Article 2. In Article 2, which has the title, Whether it is proper to the rational nature to act for an end, Aquinas here explains that the first cause in any action is the end as final cause for the action by any agent. But what is called an agent properly, quote, does not move except out of intention for an end. So this is the notion that the first cause in any action is the end, the purpose. Why are we doing the action? What are we aiming at? That's the first cause that makes us move, in a sense. But all things, of course, have ends, some moving by ends that they determine for themselves by rational intellect and will, others moving by ends determined for them in their natures by some external cause. The latter, that is, those who have ends determined by something outside their natures, move to an end by a natural inclination. That is, by an inclination built into their natures, which as such is irresistible for them. These do not have knowledge, that is, they are not intellectual, and so cannot act by will. These things. Hence, these are instruments of God in the fullest sense. Quote, all things that lack reason are, of necessity, moved to their particular ends by some rational will which extends to the universal good, namely, by the divine will. Close quote. And that's from the response to objection 3. Rational animals, however, are able to choose their ends, sometimes making good choices, other times making poor choices. For Article 3, it's asked, quote, whether human acts are specified by their end, close quote. Now note here that for his response, here and elsewhere, Aquinas holds that the natures of things are determined in their species by their forms, and Aquinas clearly states that, quote, it is the definition that shows the specific nature, close quote. This is all part of his setting up his reasoning here in his argument. I think, as we'll see, much of this flows from what has been established earlier. In fact, I know we'll see that. Let's continue with a quotation here then. The object of human will is the good and the end, writes Aquinas, and the principle of action is the end. That is the goal and the purpose. So, that is, the end follows upon the nature of the thing. But of course, since humans have reason and will, they are able to choose freely the ends they pursue. A disordered human being may have a natural end from its nature, but it is open to being distracted into pursuing ends which are not fully in accord with its nature. The conclusion of Article 3, indicating that there are specific ends for human beings, qua human beings, as well as for every nature in view of its species and manifested in its definition, leads to the issue of Article 4, whether there is one last end of human life. Again, I remind you, we want to keep an eye on the philosophy here and the theology. Again, so keep in mind whether his reasoning is philosophical, following what has been established earlier by philosophical reasoning. For example, the existence of God as will, good, intellect, and intentional creator of the natures of things. Or whether his reasoning here is theological. That's a question I want to take up in class on Thursday. In the response to Article 4, Aquinas reasons that there cannot be an indefinite and an unending procession of prior ends. If the ultimate end is removed or otherwise unavailable, all the intermediate ends will be made null and void. Aquinas distinguishes the order of intention and the order of execution, and here he's surely following Aristotle, albeit with somewhat different terminology, indicating the second is the first in action and the first is the goal, and so first in intention. That is, the first in intention is the last to be attained. So we aim to go to Chicago, and that's our intention. And it's the last thing we will do in our actions is arrive in Chicago. So the first in intention is the last to be attained. The first in execution is the last in the formation of the intention. So I reason back with my intention to perhaps go to Chicago. I reason back to the point where I must go buy a ticket on the train as the first thing I do in my action moving toward the fulfillment of the end of going to Chicago. This is very Aristotelian, but let me repeat this then. The first in intention is the last to be attained. The first in execution is the last in the formation of the intention, even if the first beginning in action. And neither of these can be infinite. Why? Why can't they be infinite? I'd like you to take some time to think about that. Why can neither of these be infinite? I'm not going to answer the question. I want you to think about it. There is one last end for human beings, and that is God. And because of that, the intermediate ends also exist without being infinite and unrealizable. Hence, there is one last end and many intermediate ends, but Article 5 considers whether one man can have several last ends. In his response, Aquinas rejects the possibility of differing last or final ends for human beings because human appetite cannot be for different ultimate perfections. First, Aquinas indicates the disorder in the soul if there are a plurality of ultimate ends, since this would mean that when one ultimate end is reached, another is yet still to be reached, which undermines the conceptual content of the term ultimate end. Second, though he does not put it in this way, the disorder of the form and the species with regard to its end specified in its definition is part of this consideration. More directly, however, Aquinas indicates that there would be a confusion among the appetites for what is desired, since there must be one ultimate goal of a rational appetite, not several. That is, it needs to be one. Third, thinking in similar ways, Aquinas writes the following, quote, "Since all things that can be desired by the will belong, as such, to one genus, the last end must needs be one. And all the more because in every genus there is one first principle, and the last end has the nature of a first principle, as stated above. Now, as the last end of man, simply as man, is to the whole human race, so is the last end of any individual man to that individual. Therefore, just as of all men there is naturally one last end, so the will of an individual man must be fixed on one last end. There would be just chaos were there not just one end. If there were a plurality of ends, and then one would have to determine which among them should be first. Or if they're all co-equal, what happens if we attain one of three ends, but not, and that is ultimate? Are the others ultimate or not? Article 6 is on whether a man will all, whatever he wills, for the last end. So does a human being will everything just for the last end? Now, before we proceed, let's think about this and raise the question of whether the answer has already been provided implicitly in what has gone before, such that we need only analyze what preceded for us to attain the answer in this article. Simply put, pardon me, everything has a good that follows its nature. Things that have intellect have will, and so these things will the last end, as at least implicitly, even if they can be distracted by weakness and diverted to lesser imperfect ends. Aquinas then writes, quote, "First, because whatever man desires, he desires under the aspect of good." That's analytic. And if he desire it not as his perfect good, which is the last end, he must of necessity desire it as tending to the perfect good. Why? Because the beginning of anything is always ordained to its completion. So the lesser always has to be aimed at the greater in the completeness of ends. I go on. As is clearly the case in effects both of nature and of art. Wherefore, every beginning of perfection is ordained to complete perfection, which is achieved through the last end. Secondly, because the last end stands in the same relation in moving the appetite as the first mover in other movements. Now, it's clear that secondary moving causes do not move, save inasmuch as they are moved by the first mover. Therefore, secondary objects of appetite, desire, do not move the appetite, except as ordained to the first object of the appetite, which is the last end. The ultimate end motivates us in all the intermediate ends. Now note how the reasoning of Article 7 follows from what has already been established. Article 7 has the title, "Whether all men have the same last end." Two things should be considered here. One, the nature, that is ratio or aspect. I don't like the translation. I prefer nature for ratio instead of aspect. The nature of the last end itself. And two, that in which the last end is realized. Now, as an aside, I tell you, Aristotle in Book 2 of De Anima speaks of finality as involving, one, that at which something aims, and two, the being for whose good the end is achieved. Aquinas is reflecting that here. All human beings, one, quote, desire the fulfillment of their perfection, and it is precisely this fulfillment in which the last end consists. So all desire for ultimate fulfillment. But two, that which they attain and realize can be, in some cases, much less, since what is attained may not be the proper end, but rather some lesser good than the ultimate good appropriate for human beings as intellectual. That is, we can fail to act in perfect accordance with the ultimate end of our human happiness. We can be distracted by money, desire, pleasure, other sorts of things, honor, which Aquinas will talk about later on. So, has the account thus far been theological? Or has it been a philosophical analysis of accepted conceptual meanings and a drawing out of their senses through analytical thinking? We can talk about this in class. The title of Article 8 is Whether Other Creatures Concur in the Last End. The answer is obvious. All things are going to concur in the last end. We've already had this. But let's look at the text closely. Distinguishing via Aristotle between 1, the end as that for which, and 2, the end as that by which, he was using Aristotle's physics, he says, Aquinas reasons easily that God is the end as 1, that is the end as that for which, the final end, and that 2, the acquisition of that end, is through knowing and loving God on the part of rational intellectual creatures. Quote, "For man and other rational creatures attain to their last end by knowing and loving God. This is not possible to other creatures, which acquire their last end insofar as they share in the divine likeness, inasmuch as they are, or live, or even know. And I would say then, in some extended sense of know, because properly speaking, knowledge in its most complete sense is intellectual and rational, whereas animals are not. But so he's using know here in an extended sense. Question 2 also has 8 articles, the last of which is whether man's happiness consists in any created good. Aquinas' conclusion, not surprisingly, is negative, as we must expect. He writes, quote, "It is impossible for any created good to constitute man's happiness. For happiness is the perfect good which satisfies." Take note, by the way, I've changed the translation. I underline what I've changed. "For happiness is the perfect good which satisfies the appetite altogether. Else it would not be the last end, if something yet remained to be desired. Now the object of the will, that is, of man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal true. Hence it's evident that naught can satisfy man's will save the universal good. That is, nothing can satisfy a human being's will except the universal good. This is to be found not in any creature, but in God alone. Why? Because every creature has goodness by participation. Wherefore God alone can satisfy the will of man. According to the words of Psalm 102, "Who satisfies thy desire with good things?" Therefore God alone constitutes man's happiness. Now, just as an aside, I'd like you to reflect on whether, in fact, this has been established through theology or philosophy. Now, note the form of this response. Up to the confirming citation of Psalm 102, the entire discussion of Aquinas follows on the basis of the philosophical analysis that preceded. The only thing that is contingent in what he states is the question of whether it is altogether true that, quote, "the object of the will, that is, of man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal true." Close quote. That seems to be what can be viewed by us as contingent. And yet, has he earlier established that? That's something to discuss in class. And this takes us all through the issue of the ultimate object of the will, and through the issue of the ultimate end of created things, through to the issue of whether all things are created by God, and whether God is intellect and will such that God creates with intention and purpose necessarily, and so places in each thing a desire for its ultimate end and perfection, namely God. This is the reditio, the return that we discussed in an earlier class, in fact, the lectures for last week. But that has all been established philosophically earlier. You see that I'm responding to Wieland. I intend to respond to Wieland in this way. Now that we have seen how Aquinas draws the consequences of his previous discussion, his previous discussion, to conclude in question 8 that there is no created good that can constitute a human being's ultimate happiness, we can quickly look to articles 1 through 7 more easily. And I should note here, of course, that Aquinas is to some extent following Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 5 in this analysis, although he's a bit more elaborate here. Article 2 asks whether a man's happiness consists in wealth, which receives a negative answer, of course, after a distinction between natural wealth and artificial wealth. Neither of these satisfies as ultimate human happiness, and a key to this is mentioned in the response to the third objection, quote, "The desire for natural riches is not infinite," close quote. That is, it can be satisfied. And so it is not what human beings seek, because human beings are seeking something that is a fulfillment to an infinite desire. And the desire for artificial riches is without end, or infinite, but not infinite in the same way that the desire for the sovereign good as possessed is infinitely demanding to a human being. So we may have many things that we want, but an infinite possibility of artificial ends and that sort of thing. But this is not satisfying, pardon me, sufficiently satisfying as the ultimate end of a human being. Article 3 asks whether man's happiness consists in honors, but for Aquinas, such a thing is only part of happiness, a share of happiness, as it were, though certainly not man's perfect good. Of course, honor is a consequence of esteem by others and not in our full control, as discussed by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. See Aquinas, by the way, see Aquinas Article 3, response to objections 2 and 3 regarding this. Here Aquinas writes in the response, quote, "It is impossible for happiness to consist in honor, for honor is given to a man on account of some excellence in him, and consequently it is a sign and attestation of the excellence that is in the person honored. Now a man's excellence is in proportion, especially to his happiness, which is man's perfect good, and to its parts, that is, those goods by which he has a certain share of happiness, and therefore honor can result from happiness. But happiness cannot principally consist in honor, therein." In response to objection number 2 in this article, Aquinas writes the following, quote, "Honor is due to God and to persons of great excellence as a sign of attestation of excellence already existing." That is, honor is posterior to the actual existence of excellence. He goes on, "Not that honor makes them excellent." Close quote. Hence, honor is not ultimate goodness. Much the same follows for Article 3, whether man's happiness consists in fame or glory, to which Aquinas makes the following response, quote, "Man's happiness cannot consist in human fame or glory, for glory consists in being well known and praised. As Ambrose says, now, the thing known is related to human knowledge otherwise than to God's knowledge, for human knowledge is caused by the things known, whereas God's knowledge is the cause of the things known." We continue the quotation. "Wherefore, the perfection of the human good, which is called happiness, cannot be caused by human knowledge, but rather human knowledge of another's happiness proceeds from and in a fashion is caused by human happiness itself, inchoate and or perfect. Consequently, man's happiness cannot consist in fame or glory. On the other hand, man's good depends on God's knowledge as its cause. And therefore, man's beatitude depends, as on its cause, on the glory which man has with God. And according to Psalm 90, quote, "I will deliver him, and I will glorify him. I will fill him with length of days, and I will show him my salvation." Close quote. Does the reasoning follow philosophically here, or only theologically? Does the theological reference to Psalm 90 serve as a confirming proof of the reasoning somehow? What exactly is its function here in the context? This is again something I'd like to take up in class. Article 4 asks whether man's happiness consists in power, and again, the response must be negative. The reasoning again seems to be philosophical. Power is a principle and a tool, but does not have the nature of the last end, which is complete happiness. Further, it can be used for good or for bad. But happiness is proper to a human being, and so is only good and for good. Quote, "Wherefore some happiness might consist in the good use of power, which is by virtue, rather than in the power itself." Close quote. So there is no need for us to go through in detail here the rest of the response, though it is philosophically interesting and worthy of study. Article 5 asks whether man's happiness consists in any bodily good. Isn't the response obvious from what's already preceded in our reasoning? First, human beings have their perfection not in the body, but in the will and intellect or reason. Hence, quote, it is evident that man is ordained to something as his end, since man is not the supreme good. Therefore the last end of man's reason and will cannot be the preservation of man's being, and I would add, in the body. So it isn't just for the sake of the bodily good that our happiness does not consist in just the bodily good. Second, as per Aristotle, De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 1 and following, the body exists for the sake of the soul, and the soul is the formal, efficient, and final cause of the body, in Aristotle. Aquinas writes in his own voice, quote, "All goods of the body are ordained to the goods of the soul, as to their end. Consequently, happiness, which is man's last end, cannot consist in goods of the body." Article 6 asks whether man's happiness consists in pleasure. Again, isn't the response yet again obvious from what's been already reasoned? In his response, Aquinas writes the following: "Because bodily delights are more generally known, the name of pleasure has been appropriated to them," that's quotation from the Ethics, "although other delights excel them, and yet happiness does not consist in them. Now a fitting good, if indeed it be the perfect good, is precisely man's happiness. And if it is imperfect, it's a share of happiness, either proximate or remote or at least apparent. Therefore it's evident that neither is delight, which results from the perfect good, the very essence of happiness, but something resulting therefrom as its proper accident." But body does not bring ultimate human good, for, as we have seen repeatedly, the fulfillment of human being is through its highest powers of reasoning and intellect. Quote, "Therefore sense, which is a power of the body, knows the singular, which is determinate through matter, whereas the intellect, which is a power independent of matter, knows the universal, which is abstracted from matter and contains an infinite number of singulars. Consequently, it is evident that good which is fitting to the body and which causes bodily delight through being apprehended by sense is not man's perfect good, but is quite a trifle as compared with the good of the soul. Hence it is written in Wisdom 7:9 that all gold in comparison of her is as a little sand. And therefore bodily pleasure is neither happiness itself nor a proper accident of happiness." Article 7 asks whether some good of the soul consists in man's happiness. In his response, Aquinas again draws on Aristotle, Aristotle's discussion of the end as what is desired and what is attained. The soul is a potentiality for knowing. The soul is not the end in the first sense, but its realization and knowledge of the highest good does take place in the soul and is the perfection of the soul. To paraphrase Aquinas, happiness does belong to the soul in this latter second way, but it is brought to this fulfillment only through something external to the soul, which the soul comes to have as its object of knowing, namely the divine essence. And finally, for this video, we come to question 2, Article 8, which we considered earlier with its conclusion, quote, "It is impossible for any created good to constitute man's happiness, for happiness is the perfect good which satisfies the appetite altogether, else it would not be the last end, if something yet remained to be desired. Now the object of the will, that is of man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal true. Hence it is evident that naught can satisfy man's will save universal good, the universal good. This is to be found not in any creature, but in God alone, because every creature has goodness by participation, wherefore God alone can satisfy the will of man, according to the words of Psalm 102, "Who satisfies thy desire with good things?" Therefore God alone constitutes man's happiness. Again, I ask you whether Aquinas has reached this conclusion theologically or philosophically. and I leave this as something for class discussion. Now, my plan was to try, I said at the beginning of this video, I was going to try to have it all in one video, and that proved not to be possible. So there will be a video 12b, this will be 12a, and there will be a video 12b, and that will concern question 3, and that will come a little bit later. So without further ado, I stop here.